Imagine you are a general. You have been handed command of an army that just suffered one of the worst defeats in your nation's history. You are not a commander of a ragtag local defense force. You command the most feared professional military apparatus on the face of the earth. Your soldiers are the product of an empire that spans the globe, veterans of campaigns that have crushed uprisings and shattered rival superpowers. Your infantry is drilled to a level of mechanical perfection that terrifies your enemies. Your artillery can level cities. Your navy controls the oceans. And yet, you are standing on the deck of a warship, looking out at a muddy hill, realizing that a disorganized mob of farmers, blacksmiths, and shopkeepers has completely outmaneuvered you in the middle of the night. How does the most disciplined fighting force in the world find itself humiliated by men who do not even possess matching uniforms? The answer lies not in grand strategy, but in the brutal, chaotic reality of a single summer day where the established rules of warfare were violently dismantled. The situation was a paradox of military power. It was the early summer of 1775. The British Army, the undisputed masters of conventional warfare, found themselves entirely trapped inside the city of Boston. A city that was supposed to be their stronghold had become their prison. Following the disastrous and bloody retreat from Lexington and Concord weeks earlier, an estimated 15,000 colonial militiamen had descended upon the outskirts of Boston, effectively placing the British garrison under a suffocating siege. This was an intolerable situation for the British High Command. The Empire could not allow itself to be held hostage by what they considered an armed rabble of treasonous subjects. The military reality, however, was stark and highly complex. Boston was essentially an island, connected to the mainland by only a narrow neck of land. The geography of the region dictated the entire strategic landscape. Whoever controlled the heights surrounding the city controlled the city itself. If the colonial forces managed to place heavy artillery on either the Dorchester Heights to the south or the Charlestown Peninsula to the north, the British position would become completely untenable. The British fleet, the very foundation of their imperial projection of power, would be blown out of the shallow harbour, and the garrison would be forced to surrender or face absolute annihilation. The man tasked with breaking this terrifying deadlock was Major General William Howe. Howe was a towering figure in the British military establishment. Aristocratic, deeply experienced, and thoroughly conventional in his tactical thinking. He was a distinguished veteran of the French and Indian War, a man who intuitively understood the complex geometry of linear warfare, the precise mathematics of artillery bombardment, and the devastating psychological impact of a disciplined bayonet charge. Howe looked at the colonial forces surrounding him and saw exactly what any 18th century European officer of his rank and pedigree would see. He saw a mob. He saw men without proper training, without a unified command structure, without adequate logistics, and critically, without the sheer psychological conditioning required to stand and fight in open combat against professional heavy infantry. Howe believed, as did almost every senior officer under his command, that at the very first sight of glittering British steel and the relentless mechanical advance of a scarlet line, the American militia would break and run in sheer terror. It was not merely a matter of imperial arrogance, but a matter of established, proven military doctrine. Untrained levies simply did not stand against regulars. It was considered an unshakable law of nature. Opposing Howe was a man of entirely different composition and background. Colonel William Prescott was a seasoned veteran, having served with distinction in the provincial forces during King George War and the massive conflicts of the French and Indian War, but he was fundamentally a civilian leader at heart. He was a prosperous farmer and a respected local magistrate from Groton, Massachusetts. Prescott did not have the elite pedigree of a British aristocrat, nor did he possess a massive, highly trained staff of logisticians, quartermasters, and tactical planners. What he did possess was an unshakable, quiet resolve and an absolute, intimate understanding of the men he commanded. Prescott knew perfectly well that his men could not stand in an open field against British regulars. They did not have the years of brutal discipline required to perform the complex, clockwork maneuvers required in European linear warfare. But Prescott also knew that these men were exceptional, deadly marksmen. They had grown up hunting game to feed their families and defending their isolated settlements from continuous threats. They understood exactly how to shoot accurately under pressure, and more importantly, they understood the immense tactical value of the land they were standing on. Prescott understood that to fight the British successfully, he had to force them to attack a heavily fortified position on terms they did not dictate. He had to artificially level the playing field by putting a massive wall of hardened earth between his farmers and the terrifying reach of the British bayonets. The colonial plan to achieve this was audacious in its simplicity and terrifying in its physical execution. Intelligence had reached the American camp that General Howe and the British command staff were actively planning to secure the heights of the Charlestown Peninsula to relieve the crushing pressure on Boston. The colonial leadership, recognizing the existential threat this posed, decided to preempt this maneuver with a massive risk. On the dark night of June 16th, Prescott led a vanguard force of approximately 1,200 men out of the sprawling American encampment at Cambridge. They moved in total, agonizing silence. Orders were strictly whispered down the line. Equipment and canteens were muffled with cloth to prevent any metallic clinking. They crossed the narrow, vulnerable neck of land, connecting the mainland to the Charlestown Peninsula, and marched in the pitch dark toward the highest geographical point, Bunker Hill. However, in the profound confusion of the night, or perhaps due to a rapid tactical decision made on the ground by Prescott and his chief engineers, upon assessing the terrain, the force bypassed the summit of Bunker Hill entirely and continued further down the sloping peninsula to a lower, much more exposed prominence known as Breed's Hill. This new position was significantly closer to Boston, placing them dangerously, almost suicidally close to the heavy guns of the British warships anchored securely in the harbour below. Once they reached the exposed top of Breed's Hill, the real, back-breaking work began. Under the absolute cover of darkness, working entirely by the faint light of the stars and the dim, distant glow of the occupied city they were besieging, 1,200 men began to dig for their lives. They had to construct a massive, complex earthen fort, a defensive redoubt, measuring roughly 160 feet on each side. They dug with a frantic, desperate energy, fueled by pure adrenaline. They knew with absolute certainty that if the sun rose before the dirt walls were high enough to stop a heavy lead musket ball, they would be slaughtered wholesale by the British artillery. The physical labor required was staggering. Men swung heavy pickaxes into the unforgiving, rocky New England soil, shoveling tons of loose dirt into massive defensive parapets, constructing rough wooden firing platforms from scavenged timber, and digging deep perimeter trenches. They worked without rest for 6 grueling hours, cold sweat soaking their rough civilian clothes, their hands blistering and bleeding in the dark, driven by the absolute, primal certainty that their lives depended entirely on the depth and thickness of the trench before them. As the first pale light of dawn finally broke over the cold waters of Boston Harbor on the morning of June 17th, the British sentries standing watch on the deck of the warship HMS Lively rubbed their eyes in sheer disbelief. Where there had been an empty, peaceful green hill just the night before, there was now a sprawling, formidable earthen fortress commanding the strategic heights, absolutely swarming with armed colonial militia. The immediate military response was instinctual and violent. The HMS Lively opened fire without hesitation, its heavy naval guns roaring to life, sending massive solid iron shot crashing into the newly dug earthworks. The naval bombardment rapidly spread across the water to the other massive ships in the harbour, the Somerset, the Cerberus, and the Glasgow, as well as to the heavy British artillery batteries positioned in Boston itself. The combined noise was deafening, a continuous, rolling thunder that shook the ground. For the untrained American militia, the vast majority of whom had never experienced the sheer terror of being under heavy artillery fire, it was a psychologically shattering ordeal. Yet inside the dusty, chaotic redoubt, Colonel Prescott maintained absolute, unnatural calm. When a cannonball instantly took the head off one of his men, causing immediate panic to ripple through the tightly packed ranks, Prescott did not shout, he did not run, and he did not panic. He calmly climbed up atop the exposed dirt parapet, fully exposing his entire body to the ongoing lethal bombardment, and began to slowly, deliberately walk the perimeter of the wall, inspecting the defenses and offering quiet, steady words of encouragement to the terrified men below him. His sheer, undeniable physical courage instantly stabilized the wavering line. If the commander could casually walk along the top of the wall while solid iron cannonballs flew past his head, the men collectively decided they could stay in the trench and fight. General Howe now faced a critical, highly complex tactical dilemma. The Americans had effectively checkmated him overnight. The heavily fortified redoubt on Breed's Hill was a literal dagger pointed directly at the heart of the British position in Boston. He absolutely had to remove it, and he had to do it immediately. He had two primary options. The first, and tactically soundest option by any standard military metric, was to use his naval supremacy to land his forces at the extremely narrow neck of the Charlestown Peninsula, effectively cutting off the only avenue of American retreat and starving them out without a fight. The American forces trapped on the hill had highly limited water, virtually no provisions, and severely limited ammunition. By securing the neck, Howe could have ended the battle in a matter of days without a massive, bloody frontal assault. However, Howe firmly rejected this option. He believed a profound, unforgettable psychological statement needed to be made to the rebellion. The uprising had to be crushed forcefully, visibly, and overwhelmingly. He wanted to demonstrate to the colonists and to the entire watching world the absolute, unquestionable superiority of British arms. He chose a direct, frontal amphibious assault against a fortified position elevated on high ground. It was a decision deeply rooted in military arrogance, a fundamental belief that British regulars could simply march through any makeshift obstacle the colonials could manage to build. Understanding the intricate logistics behind massive troop maneuvers like this is what separates casual history fans from true tactical analysts. If you are serious about studying how complex battles are actually won and lost on the ground, subscribing to this channel ensures you get a detailed, comprehensive breakdown of these decisive moments every single week. Now, as the British landing boats began their agonizingly slow journey across the sunlit water, the true scale of the impending violence became horrifyingly clear to everyone watching. The British military mobilization was a masterpiece of logistical organization, but it was agonizingly slow to execute. It took hours of precise coordination to safely ferry approximately 2,400 regular infantrymen across the harbour waters in heavy wooden longboats. These were not average garrison soldiers. These were the absolute elite of the British Army. Towering grenadiers, distinguished by their massive bearskin caps, specifically designed to make them look physically larger and more terrifying in combat. Light infantry, the highly mobile, aggressive skirmishers of the army. And the veteran line infantry, the rock-solid, unbreakable core of the British military machine. They landed on the eastern tip of the peninsula and began to meticulously form up in perfect, precise, linear formations. The visual impact of this deployment was specifically designed to be psychologically overwhelming. Thousands of men in brilliant, spotless scarlet coats, stark white crossbelts, and highly polished brass, moving with absolute mechanical synchronicity. The summer sun was now high in the sky, beating down mercilessly on the troops. The temperature soared to oppressive levels. The British soldiers were wearing heavy, dense wool uniforms and carrying over 60 pounds of combat gear, including their heavy musket, abundant ammunition, rations, and a lethal bayonet. Just standing still in formation under the midday heat was physically exhausting. General Howe meticulously organized his assault force into two massive, distinct wings. He would personally lead the right wing, aiming to push aggressively along the beach to completely flank the American redoubt, attempting to hit them devastatingly from the side and rear. Brigadier General Robert Pigot would command the left wing, tasked with a brutal, direct frontal assault against the redoubt itself to pin the defenders in place. As the British lines finally began their slow advance, they were meant to be heavily supported by field artillery, but the artillery corps quickly ran into a disastrous, almost comical logistical error. The heavy cannons were supplied with large 12-pound iron balls, but the guns that had actually been brought ashore were smaller 6-pounders. The artillery was rendered virtually useless for the crucial initial advance, forcing the heavily burdened infantry to carry the entire weight of the assault on their shoulders. The long British line began to move slowly forward. The physical terrain was absolutely brutal. They had to march uphill, through thick grass that was often waist-high, navigating clumsily over scattered stone walls and heavy wooden fences that constantly broke their perfect, necessary formations. They moved slowly, deliberately, the military drums beating a steady, deeply ominous cadence across the field. Inside the redoubt, the psychological tension was nearly unbearable. The American militia, numbering around 1,500 men, crouched low behind their dirt walls, gripping their muskets tight. They had virtually no bayonets for close combat. They had highly limited, precious supplies of black powder and lead musket balls. Every single shot fired had to count. The American officers, prominently including Prescott and the fiery Israel Putnam, paced the interior lines, issuing strict, desperate orders to the men. They knew that if the militia fired too early, at a distance where their highly inaccurate smoothbore muskets would simply miss, the British regulars would easily close the remaining distance and slaughter them wholesale with bayonets while they were desperately trying to reload. The order passed down the line was clear, brutal, and became instantly legendary. Do not fire until you see the whites of their eyes. Aim low, pick off the commanders. Look for the men in the brightest coats. The massive British line closed the distance to within 100 yards. The Americans held their fire in terrifying silence. The British closed to within 50 yards. The Americans still held their fire. The silence on the hill was unnatural and terrifying, broken only by the loud sound of hundreds of British boots marching through the dry grass and the relentless beat of the drums. When the advancing British regulars were a mere 40 yards away, virtually point-blank range for a massed musket volley, the order was finally shouted at the top of the officers' lungs. Fire! The entire earthen wall erupted in a continuous, deafening sheet of orange flame and thick, blinding white smoke. The American volley was devastatingly, horrifyingly accurate. Because they were firing from a rested, stable position behind a wall, and because they had specifically aimed low at a tightly massed target, the heavy lead balls completely shattered the front British lines. Men fell by the dozens in an instant. The British officers, specifically targeted by the colonial marksmen as ordered, were decimated in seconds. The sheer, overwhelming volume of fire and its lethal accuracy completely shocked the veteran British regulars. Entire companies lost their commanders and sergeants instantly. The psychological shock of this slaughter was immense. The supposedly invincible British infantry stopped dead in their tracks, staggered backward, and then, completely against all training and expectation, they broke. They turned and retreated rapidly down the hill in disarray, leaving the tall grass heavily littered with the dead and dying. The American militiamen inside the redoubt erupted in massive cheers. They had faced the most terrifying military machine on earth, head-on, and broken it. Down on the beach, General Howe was in a state of absolute, uncomprehending shock. He had expected the untrained Americans to run in panic at the mere sight of the advancing bayonets. Instead, his own veteran men had been brutally butchered and repulsed. The casualty rate among his senior officers was absolutely catastrophic. But Howe was a hardened professional. He aggressively reformed his shattered lines. He brought up fresh reinforcements from the landing zone. He realized quickly that his flanking maneuver on the beach had been stopped cold by a hidden colonial defensive line positioned behind a stone wall. He resolved to focus the entire combined weight of his force on a massive, coordinated second assault against the main redoubt and the breastworks extending from it. To add to the sheer terror of the situation, the British admiral anchored in the harbour, infuriated by continuous sniper fire coming from the nearby town of Charlestown, ordered the fleet to aggressively fire heated iron shot directly into the dense wooden buildings. Charlestown rapidly erupted in a massive, uncontrollable inferno, the entire sky filled with thick, choking black smoke. The roaring of the massive flames, The continuous thunder of the heavy naval guns and the agonizing heat rolling across the water created a scene that shaken witnesses described as an absolute vision of hell on earth. Through this apocalyptic nightmare landscape, the British Army marched back up the steep hill a second time. The bloody bodies of their comrades lay everywhere in the tall grass, forcing the advancing lines to physically step over the dead and wounded as they moved forward. The ambient heat from the sun and the burning town was now suffocating. The men were physically exhausted, severely dehydrated and terrified, but deep military discipline held their formations together. They advanced again, bayonets securely fixed, drums beating the advance. Inside of the redoubt, the tactical situation was growing incredibly desperate. The Americans were running dangerously, critically low on ammunition. Men were frantically biting the ends off their remaining paper cartridges, pouring the scarce powder down the hot barrels and ramming home the heavy lead balls. Again, they waited in silence. The psychological tension was even worse the second time around. They waited until the British were almost completely on top of them, literally stepping over the bodies from the first failed assault. Again, the desperate command was given. The volley tore through the British ranks with the exact same horrifying, lethal effectiveness. The carnage was unbelievable. Howe himself stood near the very front of the line, completely untouched by the storm of lead, while virtually every single officer of his immediate staff was violently shot down around him. The British line shuddered under the impact, collapsed entirely, and for a second unbelievable time, the regular heavy infantry turned and fled down the blood-soaked hill in panic. The American victory seemed miraculously complete, but it was a fleeting illusion. The brutal, unforgiving reality of military logistics was about to dictate the brutal end of the battle. The militia in the redoubt had fought magnificently, beyond all expectation, but they had fired almost all of their available ammunition. Desperate men were frantically searching the cartridge boxes of the dead and wounded for a single extra shot. Some men had a small handful of loose powder left. Others had absolutely none at all. Prescott knew the situation was absolutely critical and rapidly deteriorating. He ordered his men to hold their ground no matter what, to use their last remaining shots only when the enemy was at the very top of the wall. At the bottom of the hill, General Howe was a man pushed to the absolute psychological brink. To order a third frontal assault seemed like utter madness. His magnificent army was being systematically destroyed by farmers. Yet, to accept a humiliating defeat at the hands of armed peasants was completely unthinkable. It would mean the immediate end of his long career and a devastating permanent blow to the prestige of the empire. He ordered his men to strip off and drop their heavy packs. He ordered them to fix bayonets and prepare for close quarters. There would be no stopping to fire this time. The third assault would be a pure, desperate charge of cold steel, designed to carry the redoubt by sheer physical force of will, regardless of the staggering cost in human lives. The British advanced up the hill for the third time. They moved much faster now, stripped of their cumbersome gear, driven by a mixture of rage and desperation. The colonial defenders watched them come through the thick smoke, knowing they had almost nothing left to stop the massive wave of steel. When the British were just yards away, the Americans unleashed their final ragged volley. It tore deep holes in the British line, but this time it was simply not enough to stop the sheer momentum of the charge. The redcoats surged forward, screaming, swarming up and over the high earthen parapets. The battle now completely devolved into a nightmare of brutal, intimate hand-to-hand combat inside the cramped redoubt. This is the precise moment where the true, desperate grit of the American militia revealed itself to history. They had no steel bayonets to counter the British thrusts. They had no powder left to shoot. As the professional soldiers violently spilled over the dirt walls, thrusting lethally with their long bayonets, the American farmers did not surrender or beg for quarter. They absolutely refused to yield the ground they had built with their own bare hands. In an act of primal, desperate defiance, the militiamen turned their empty, heavy muskets around, gripping the hot barrels tightly, and used the heavy wooden stocks as massive, improvised clubs. swinging wildly at the heads of the advancing redcoats. And when the wooden musket stocks shattered violently against British skulls and helmets, the colonists dropped to their knees in the dirt, digging their bleeding, blistered hands into the earth. They ripped large, heavy rocks directly from the dirt walls of the redoubt and hurled them with all their strength directly into the faces of the advancing British infantry. They fought professional soldiers, armed with the absolute finest weapons of the age, with bare hands, shattered wood, and heavy stones. It was a chaotic, bloody, screaming brawl in the suffocating dust and smoke, a testament to an absolute refusal to be broken. The overwhelming numerical superiority and the lethal reach of the bayonet eventually dictated the bloody outcome. The redoubt was comprehensively breached from 3 sides simultaneously. Colonel Prescott, fighting furiously until the absolute last possible second, parrying lethal bayonet thrusts with his ceremonial officer sword, finally ordered a general retreat to save his remaining men. The American forces conducted a desperate, fighting withdrawal, falling back chaotically across the peninsula under incredibly heavy fire, suffering their worst casualties of the entire day during the retreat, including the tragic death of the highly respected colonial leader, Dr. Joseph Warren. The British infantry finally took total control of Breeds Hill and Bunker Hill. The shattered field officially belonged to them. But the sheer cost of this victory was so catastrophic that it completely and fundamentally altered the entire trajectory of the war. When the smoke finally cleared over the harbour and the official casualty reports were meticulously compiled, the numbers were staggering. The British Army had suffered 1,054 total casualties, 226 dead and 828 wounded. This was nearly half of the entire assault force that had engaged in the battle. More devastatingly, a hugely disproportionate number of these casualties were senior officers and veteran sergeants. The American marksmen had systematically dismantled the vital command structure of the British forces in Boston. By contrast, the American forces, despite eventually losing the ground, suffered roughly 450 casualties. The massive shockwave of this numerical reality ripped violently through the British High Command in London. Lieutenant General Henry Clinton, personally observing the terrible carnage on the hill, wrote a sentence in his official dispatch that perfectly encapsulated the scale of the disaster. "A dear bought victory. Another such would have ruined us." The British had technically won the tactical engagement by finally securing the geographic objective, but they had suffered a massive, debilitating strategic and psychological defeat. The powerful myth of British military invincibility was permanently, violently shattered on that bloody hill. Before June 17th, the British High Command firmly believed the colonial rebellion could be easily swept aside with a minor show of force. After surviving the 3 brutal assaults on the redoubt, they realized with horror they were facing a highly motivated population that was willing to stand toe-to-toe with the finest infantry in the world, willing to endure heavy naval artillery bombardment, willing to fight relentlessly until their ammunition was completely gone, and willing to crush skulls with heavy rocks when all else failed. The British never again systematically underestimated the American resolve. They remained effectively bottled up in Boston for another 9 miserable months, ultimately evacuating the city entirely by sea. The American militia had lost the physical hill, but they had decisively won the psychological war. They proved to themselves, to the arrogant British, and to the powerful French observers watching closely from Europe, that this was not a minor, easily crushed colonial riot. This was a brutal war, and the colonials possessed the extreme, violent determination required to fight it to the very bitter end. Today, a massive, soaring granite obelisk stands at the very top of Breeds Hill, rising high into the sky over the busy, modern streets of Charlestown. It is a quiet, highly solemn place, surrounded by beautifully manicured green lawns and tourists slowly walking the historic Freedom Trail. But beneath that silent, heavy stone lies the dark earth that was thoroughly soaked in the lifeblood of an empire and the desperate sweat of a defiant militia. The monument does not merely mark a geographic location, it marks the exact coordinate in history where the firmly established rules of imperial dominance were violently rewritten by men who simply refused to break, even when all they had left were stones in their bleeding hands. That is the true, enduring legacy of the redoubt. If this tactical breakdown gave you a powerful new perspective on how raw determination can rewrite military doctrine, leave a comment below with your specific thoughts on Prescott's command decisions, and make sure you are officially subscribed for our next deep dive into the brutal battles that fundamentally shaped history.